Apologize for breaking into conversations, but you've all clearly gotten a copy of the Royal Society report and are doing your homework immediately. So that is both welcome, but I will interrupt it so that you can hear from two of the outstanding group of experts that brought this report together and collaborated to tackle the small topic of trying to understand the relationship between people and the planet. As per Royal Society's habit, they take both big but also really weighty questions and bring a diverse international group of experts to bear on these questions from a scientific perspective. And so it's terrific to have a second or even a third discussion of this report here at the Center. I want to welcome you all to the Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I have the good fortune of directing our environmental change and security program here at the Wilson Center, and particularly in today's context with the whole team here as part of the HELPS project, as we call it, Health, Environment, Livelihoods, Population, and Security Project. So when one tackles people on the planet, some of those same themes come up, as you might imagine. We are, as I think many of you know, a nonpartisan, non-advocacy forum here at the Wilson Center that is meant to reflect Wilson's legacy as a scholar and a politician, bringing the worlds of research together with practitioners, which very much reflected in today's discussion with Elia and Parfait on the Royal Society report, bringing the world's leading experts on issues into a policy forum and discussion to try to understand what we know and don't know about these issues and then go forward and act upon them. We have this opportunity today, and many in the same issue area under our HELPS grant, with the generous support and collaboration of USAID's Office of Population and Reproductive Health. It's terrific to see Scott Radloff here, the director of the office, and others as well. It gives me an opportunity to also say it was Scott and Jeff Spieler and others at AID, and then many of you here in the audience today too, who a little over a year ago, when Sir John Sulston, the chair of this panel, was in town with colleagues, had an opportunity to talk to experts in D.C. and in what they, Royal Society, call evidence taking. So we had a number of meetings here as well as Sir John presenting the ideas that the members of the committee tackled. And so it's terrific to kind of come back and circle back and hear from Elia and Parfait about what the committee came up with, because it was a wide remit and certainly a challenging brief to take on these topics. I'm going to let them say more about the report and turn it over to them, because they are both experts on these topics and have very rich research agendas that they can draw upon, but also then, of course, are telling us about what they, as part of the larger group, found for the report. We will start with Dr. Parfait Eloundou-Enyegue, who is Associate Professor at the Department of Development Sociology at Cornell, an Associate Director of the Cornell Population Program. Parfait is a returnee to the Wilson Center. It's terrific to welcome him back, and someone whom we've also had the good fortune of publishing in our Environmental Change and Security Program report, copies of which you can find outside and certainly online. So it's terrific to welcome him back. And Elia Zulu is also coming back to the center, and it's terrific to welcome him. He's the Executive Director of the African Institute for Development Policy. And it really has a mission of sitting at that interface between research and practice, doing that from Kenya, drawing on research in a variety of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's terrific to have Elia here. I think last time we saw one another was in Dakar at the big International Family Planning Conference, where he spoke very eloquently on these issues. So we look forward to welcoming him back to the center as well. I think we have the PowerPoint up, and Parfait, I think we'll turn the floor over to you. Just one final housekeeping. We are webcasting today's event, and so those of you who are watching online, you should be able to open the slides there right next to the video window, so that'll make it easier for you to read the slides. And then when it comes to Q&A time, we'll just ask folks here in the room to use the mic so the people online can hear your questions. So Parfait, we'll turn the floor over to you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. It's my pleasure to be here again today. I was here last year. I've just been introduced, so there's no need to introduce myself again, except to add one thing that may not be obvious to most of you, is that I come from Africa, as does Elia. And I can continue a little bit. Elia and I have something else in common, is that in this panel we were demographers. And this panel gave us the opportunity to try to stretch our wings a little bit and study topics that were not necessarily familiar to us. And so when Jeff says the exercise was challenging, I could not think of a bigger understatement. Now, this presentation, I'm not quite sure how many of you have read the report, but even if you haven't, for many at the center, this may be a bit of deja vu because we were here last year, I believe, discussing the same basic idea, trying to think about what this report would bring to the conversation that we've heard before around the general topic of population and development and the planet, et cetera, et cetera. So the first obvious question that I'm sure is in many people's mind is what is really new in what we have tried to accomplish and what we bring here. Now, from my perspective, and that's the reason why I was interested in this in the first place, I could see novelty in both the context and the angle of the report. We are going to talk a little bit more about the context and why it's appropriate or why it's a timely context to study this question. But I can begin with the angle. And there are things about the specific angles of this report that to me are very apparent in the title of this report. It's a report on people and the planet. It's not about population and economic growth. It's not even population and development or population and environmental change. And these words I thought, and I discussed this at great length with Sir John, were carefully chosen. The emphasis on people rather than population was meant to suggest that there's more to people than just population. There's more to population than just population size. And there's a greater foray into other dimensions of population that matter, namely age structure, namely family structure, population distribution, population movement. And so it's this broader perspective that we wanted to bring to the study of population questions. So that's the first nuance. The second nuance is that the study wanted to emphasize well-being as opposed to consumption alone. And it's an important distinction that the study wanted to dig deeper into. And there was, in a team, I think an economist who is particularly interested in these issues, and is one that deserves attention. So a greater focus on a broader aspect than population, of population beyond size, emphasis on well-being, not necessarily consumption. Another interesting aspect from my perspective is that it tended to pay attention to questions of global equity when we're discussing consumption. It wasn't just about raising or reducing consumption per capita on average, but to recognize that there are vast disparities in consumption across the world, and that the aspirations among those in the least developed countries were to match the consumption standard of the most advanced countries. And these aspirations, based on, according to this report, were going to be relatively difficult to meet. They were legitimate, but they're going to be very difficult to meet. Okay. And then, of course, this is not a novelty, but it's something of reinforcement. Is just attention to questions of sustainability, preserving the planet and consumption possibilities for future generations. So there's an air of familiarity, but there are also new angles that I thought were worth investigating. And so there's no denying that the agenda was very ambitious. And for all the scientists in the room who study questions about impact of anything on anything, we all know the difficulty we face when we're trying to come up with compelling evidence about cause and effect. And so the report, as it said in the foreword, is not meant as a definitive answer to the complex relationship between population and people and the planet, but it's just to get a conversation started, or rather rekindled, in hopefully directions that are new and insightful. And so the purpose of both the report and our being here is to try to summarize what we think are some of these insights. Now, both the report roughly and our presentation is going to be articulated around the three main points here. First, as way of a background, we're going to say something about why now and the way the group worked very briefly. And then we have the meat of the presentation, which is going to focus on the four pillars of the report, essentially the population or people node, the consumption, the environment, and how all three together work to affect people's well-being. So these are the four main rubrics that are at the center of the report. And then we'll end up with the presentations. There are a set of recommendations for the global development communities, and Elia is going to expand on this recommendation. I'm going to give you the introduction, and then we are going to just alternate the presentation on the four main points here. Now, in the middle here, we'll discuss the trends in each of the four pillars: trends and drivers of population, trends and drivers of consumption, trends and drivers in the environment, etc. All right, so this is roughly how the presentation is going to be structured. Now, why now? Okay, and so the first answer is that this is a time of rapid and multifaceted change in both population and the planet. Now, on the people or population side, you have not just the continued population growth, but you have a wider diversity in population situations. And you have changes that are affecting not just the size, the growth of the population, but also changes in family structure, in the population distribution, population movements. And all these factors are increasingly recognized as having consequences for well-being. The second is also a time when consumption is increasing. But beyond the increase in consumption itself, there's also a dramatic rise in aspiration. People are more in greater contact, and these tends to encourage, either through media communication or movement of people, you have an increasing aspiration to mimic or to emulate the consumption standard of the more industrialized countries. And so together, these changes in population, as well as in consumption and consumption aspiration, have implications for the extent to which we can meet these aspirations. And so the question that the report is trying to address is whether we can actually envision a world in which we can sustainably and equitably meet the consumption needs of 7 billion people and the more to come. So that's the first reason why now isn't a good time. There's a second reason, which Elia is more in tune to, because he's more connected to the policy world, is that there are many high-level conferences that are coming up, Rio ICPD +20, and evaluation of the MDGs. And this is going to be the opportunity to rethink the connections between population and development or the environment. And so this report would be a good foundation to feed into these discussions. Now, the work of the Royal Society, briefly, involved collaboration between a large number of experts, and if you're just like me, you cringe whenever you hear the word expert. But you had people coming from different areas of science or scientific research. In the list, by my own sort of informal counting, we had about half being specialists in population science, and the rest came from environment, economics, the humanities, or areas that were not clearly specified. Okay. Now, the numbers themselves don't tell the full story. You could have many population specialists, but they may not be in leading roles, so the numbers don't say anything major about the direction of the effort. In terms of geographic origin, you also had about half from Europe, and the rest, Europe mostly Great Britain, and the rest coming from the US, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, in that order. Okay, and so the study itself is lasted roughly 21 months. Not quite sure if it covers from where to where, but it was a lengthy effort. That's the point we're trying to make here, and it was meant to give what is called a broad look at the connection between population consumption and the environment. Now, the term broad, or the idea of breadth, has both a positive and a negative. The negative is when you have this kind of broad effort, you find yourself in a situation where you actually reach far beyond your comfort zone, and in trying to cover many topics, you may not be able to give the detail that the specialists of each given area are going to probably expect. But the advantage is that you try to have something that is comprehensive and that looks at the real world and all the connections that are actually unfold in the real world, as opposed to the silos that we define in academia. And so the result of this exercise was, as I said before, 9 recommendations, 9 broad recommendations to global policymakers. And Elia will give you these recommendations at the end. But for now, I'm going to just go through what I think are the key messages, and they are actually listed in the summary, if I recall correctly. And the key messages focus each on one of the 4 pillars of our summary. There's one key message on the environment, and which is to recognize, perhaps more than before, the limits of the Earth to meet the consumption standard set by developed nations, if the idea is for everyone to meet these standards. Okay. In the area of consumption, the recommendation here, or the key message here, is that one must think about working at both ends of the consumption spectrum. On the one hand, there's a clear need to raise the consumption of the poorest to lift them out of poverty, but at the same time reduce consumption, and especially damaging consumption in developing and emerging economies. And also there's an effort to be made in the realm of population, efforts to voluntarily stabilize global population. And so that's the recommendation on consumption. On population, the idea is, again, this is focusing on global development agency, is try to integrate population in global economic and environmental planning. There's a tendency to shy away from population issues when you set development goals because they tend to be controversial. There's also a tendency to look at population and consumption when you're addressing the impact of the environment in an either-or format, as if we had to choose either population as being the main culprit or consumption. And the reality is that they all have to be integrated and considered jointly. And another message is to think, I'm not quite sure if the term here is correct, but to think about well-being in a different manner that is not exclusively tied to GDP or consumption, or at least material consumption. So these are the key messages as I highlight them in the text, and then I'll let Elia continue.
All right, thanks Parfait, and thanks Jeff, Sandeep, and all the staff here for facilitating our being here today. So I'll just carry on from where Parfait stopped to talk about the demographic sort of trends and dynamics that are covered in the study. And I think the main thing to start with, Parfait made this point, is that discussions of population are often framed in terms of population size and growth. But I think we need to recognize that population change is a dynamic process that arises from changes in mortality, fertility, and migration, and that these processes also affect the rate at which consumption, the rate of consumption, and ultimately the state of the environment. So we need to look at issues like age structure, population movements, and so on. So I think most of us have seen this graph, those who work in the population, the projections that the UN has done about where the population would be by 2100. So the key point to note here is that this century is actually represents a period of phenomenal demographic change. From 2000, the number of people aged 60 plus outnumbered the very young, that is those aged 0 to 4 for the first time in human history. We also know that in 2007, the number of urban dwellers outnumbered rural dwellers for the first time. And we know in 2011, the world population reached 7 billion. And so this chart is showing the projections up to 2100. And according to these projections, the global population will grow to between 8.1 billion and 10.6 billion by 2050, with the median variant falling at 9.3 billion people. And the main factor driving this population growth is, of course, the level and trends in fertility, since we know that I think the progress that is being made on mortality is likely to continue quite steadily in the coming years. And by the end of the century, that is 2100, the range for the three variants that the UN produces could be between 15.8 billion and 6.2 billion. And the median variant as well there is 10 billion. But I think the point is that the 15.8 billion number could actually be reached if the global total fertility remains around the current value. Now it's about 2.5. If it's around 2.5, 2.6, the population would reach 15.8 billion. But it can get to 6.2 if the fertility stabilizes around 1.6. And the 10 billion means it will get to the replacement level of fertility at 2.1. So, I mean, usually when the UN gives these numbers and gives the median variant, we often take it for granted that that is what is likely to happen. But the truth is that, the global population could actually end up close to the high variant of 15.8 billion if we go by the slow pace at which fertility has been declining in the least developed countries. And when we look at these numbers, at this time when so many people are impoverished, poor, and failing just to meet their basic needs, we need to be concerned about where the global population size is heading. Another key point is that the 21st century has been a century of phenomenal population demographic change, but it's also marked by unprecedented demographic diversity. This chart here shows the median variant projections as well for the 3 major regions of the world as classified by the UN. So the top one is the global total, but the 3 graphs below are for the 3 major regions. And in doing this report, we also debated a lot about how to approach it. I think some of the members of the group thought that we should look at geographic regions like Africa, Asia, and so on. But in the end, it was decided that we should focus on looking at countries that have the same characteristics. So the categorization that the UN uses seemed most appropriate for this purpose. So one point I need to note about the least developed countries. These are the 48 countries. Actually, they are listed on the last page of the report. The 48 poorest countries in the world, basically. But the majority of them, 32 out of that 48, are actually located in Africa. So you have a few in South Asia and Caribbean and Latin America. The less developed countries are the emerging economies, or what you might call middle-income economies, including China. So currently, the less developed countries have about 70% of the global population. But this share will go down to about 60% by 2100, when the population size will stabilize in that group to about 6 billion. Population will continue growing quite steadily in the least developed countries. Actually, well beyond this century. If you look at that, at those 3 curves there, the stabilization, the developed countries, the more developed countries have already stabilized. The less developed countries are going to stabilize by the end of the century and possibly start having some decline in population. But all this population growth we are talking about will actually come from the least developed countries. Right now, their share of the global population is about 12%. But by 2100, they'll be about they'll comprise about 27% of the global population. So when we look at the increase in the number, even just looking at the median variant between now and 2100, there will be 3.2 billion more people, and out of these, 3% will come from the developed countries, the more developed countries, 39% from the less developed countries, and 58% from the least developed countries. And if you combine, I mean, one thing you will note from the list on the last page of the report is that within Africa, countries like Nigeria are actually not listed there. So Nigeria is in the less developed countries category. But if you take Africa as a region, you see that about 70% of this total growth in human populations between now and 2100 will actually come from Africa. So I think it's important to note that global variation is not just about the numbers. We have here the more developed countries. They have below replacement level fertility. They are already widely urbanized. They are rapidly aging as well, and could experience some decline in the population. Fertility in the less developed countries has fallen to 2.3, and most of the growth in these countries, where it's expected that they will soon reach 2.1, most of the growth will be through population momentum. And many of them have a few of them have already benefited from the demographic dividend, but a number of them have high potential to benefit from the dividend as well. But the least developed countries, with an average of 4.1 children per woman and high child dependency, and they also have high potential for urbanization. So this graph here shows, it's a graph that comes from the Population Reference Bureau, basically depicting the process of the demographic transition. That as countries move from the stage 1, where you have high fertility and high mortality, to stage 2, where mostly due to declines in child mortality, while fertility is still high, that's where you actually see the most rapid population growth. In stage 3, you are actually seeing fertility also declining, and mortality decline more or less stabilizing. And there's still growth there, but in stage 3, most of the growth is actually through the population momentum effect. So when you look at the three categories of countries, you'd see, the more developed countries are mostly in stage 4. The countries in transition, the emerging economies are mostly in stage 3, while most countries in Africa and South Asia, the least developed countries, are the ones that are in stage 2. So a lot of people, the classic demographic theory argues that it's socioeconomic development that drives this process. And I think there have been some debates, in the recent past where, some scholars believe that you don't have to wait for socioeconomic development. If you have strong government-led family planning programs, they can facilitate this transition faster than, the case would be if you just wait for socioeconomic development to take place. So this chart, sorry that it's not very, very clear, but there's a clearer sort of version of it on page 24 of the report, basically just showing, again, the level of diversity across the world. And this is looking at female literacy, male life expectancy at birth. So as you can see, in Africa, most countries in Africa actually have the lowest life expectancy, which is under 60, with some pockets in Asia. This is male, and this is the same chart for female life expectancy. So there are still big differences in mortality, but as I said earlier on, I think good progress is being made in reducing mortality across the world. The big area where these differences are likely to be sustained for a long time is on fertility, and that's what this chart here shows. And again, it shows that Africa is the main outlier as far as fertility rates are concerned. Right now, the average family size in Africa is 4.7 compared to 2.5 in globally. But also, it's important to note that within Africa itself, there are very, very big variations. When I was looking at this chart, I think that if you look at the more recent data, you'll see that maybe the data had not been properly, edited and so on. The southern part of Africa and the northern part of Africa actually have fertility rates that are close to the global averages, But the rapid increase in fertility in Africa is mostly being driven by the high fertility rates in parts of East Africa, Central Africa, and West Africa. And another key thing to note is that the UN projections actually make the assumption that the high fertility countries now will follow the same pattern in terms of declining fertility as the countries that have achieved lower fertility had. But I think it's important to note that this may actually not be the case, that you might actually find a situation where fertility might stabilize around 3 to 4 children in some of the developing, least developed countries. And if that happens, it means that actually we stand a much, much bigger chance of getting to the high variant than we often tend to assume. Especially when you consider that the rate of fertility decline in Africa has been very, very slow. So why is there so much variation? So when you look at fertility change, for instance, what is it that drives fertility change, and what is it that is actually leading to all this variation? The main point there is that we know improved health, education, empowerment of women, and increased use of modern family planning methods is the key to reducing fertility. There are also cultural issues that we need to take into account there. A lot of women may be not using family planning because their spouses don't allow them to, or for religious reasons and so on. So all those are very, very critical factors. And this report emphasizes this, that it's not just about, putting family planning on the table, that there has to be, a simultaneous effort of improving women's status and also trying to make sure that those who want to have fewer children or postpone births have the means to realize those reproductive intentions. For mortality, improvements in nutrition, sanitation, public health, education, and medical care are very, very central. And also expanding, access to life-saving technologies like immunization has been very, very central in reducing mortality. We know one area where mortality is not declining as much, and this is also a problem with the least developed countries, is on maternal mortality. If you go to migration, migration is driven mostly by economic, demographic, political, and environmental factors. And as the population continues to grow, there is likely to be more conflicts due to a scarcity of natural resources like water, land, agricultural land, that is. And there's also likely to be more refugees displaced by adverse effects of climate change like flooding, recurring droughts, and so on. And another issue about urbanization. Urbanization can be, can play a key transformative role in engineering socioeconomic development, as was the case in the emerging economies and in the more developed countries. But we are seeing a pattern of urbanization, especially in most of the least developed countries as well, where urban areas are becoming now hubs of very, very, acute poverty and poor health outcomes, as shown by the example for Nairobi that is covered on page 39 of the report. I'll now turn the floor to Parfait so that he can talk about what are the highlights of what is in the report as far as consumption is concerned. Thank you.
I'll give you briefly the trends and the drivers of consumption. And here the story for anyone who works on consumption or questions of inequality is pretty straightforward and predictable. One story is one of great inequality in the world. And when we discuss inequality, there's a tendency to just jump on inequality between countries. Although that is certainly part of the equation, one piece of the equation that is often not acknowledged is the growing inequality within countries themselves. But even if we stayed on the classic focus on inequality between countries, the report highlights some of the levels of inequality, not necessarily in GDP, but in consumption. And so here are a few slides that just try to illustrate some of these inequalities, looking at common resources that are needed, basic resources for human well-being. Starting with water, this is the amount of water consumption on a per-person base, comparing countries at different levels of income. And so you can see just a clear gradient there, although things taper off at the extreme, at the high end of incomes. But at the same time, you can see some of the inequalities within groupings that are alluded to. So some of the boxes here stretch wide, which suggests large differences within these groupings. So that's one key difference in one illustration for water. For food, you have somewhat of a similar pattern. If we can just return to this for a minute. Now, you can see these differences and not necessarily appreciate how they matter. But you would capture how they matter if you use other measures that are included in the report that are indicators of water stress, which is looking at the amount of water that is being utilized as a ratio of the amount of water that is available. And so the bigger the ratio you get, the more stress is placed on water resources. And so the study did a comparison of water stress at the turn of this century compared to projections at the turn of next century. And so you can clearly see increasing levels of stress for a large number of countries in the world. If you look at the food supply, and looking particularly at meat here, there are two, these are curves, again, differentiating between countries at different income levels. And if you just focus on the, I don't know if it's orange, curve in the middle, this is the curve that corresponds to the upper middle. Is that the upper middle? Yes, country. Yeah. And where you have the remarkable rise. And that illustrates two things. First is the dramatic rise, and second is just the aspirational tendency for countries to raise their consumption of food, including food that is sensitive to incomes like meat, to rise when incomes rise. And so that's the aspiration. So the rise here has been an increase by 2.5 times. So water consumption is highly unequal. And the same thing here, if you look at the last year, 2007, the gap between the lower end country and the higher end country is much bigger than it was just 40 years ago. If you look at emission, CO2 emissions, if you just focus on, again, the world's average, the change doesn't appear to be, sorry. If you focus on CO2 emission, the change doesn't happen to be very dramatic if you just look at the short time frame we have here, which is from 1980 to 2010. But if you look at the less developed country, that is the slide below, the line below, you can see again a tendency for CO2 emissions to rise with affluence. Again, it highlights the importance of aspiration. As income rise, people consume more energy, and therefore there's more CO2 emission. More importantly, there's a slide in the report that shows you how these emissions have increased over the last century. So instead of taking 1980, if you took 1900 as a starting point, you know that CO2 emissions have increased by a level of 15 to 16 between 1900 and 2000. So it's a dramatic increase. During that time, the world population has increased by 4 times, which means that on average per capita, so you have CO2 emission increasing by 16, world population increasing by 4. It means the balance, which is the 4-fold increase, was driven by the increase in consumption of CO2 emission per capita. And so this a dramatic increase, not just in population, but also in consumption and emission per person. All right. And if you know that a lot of this increase was driven by industrialized countries, the actual rate of increase in these countries was particularly dramatic. Okay. If you look at the extraction of minerals, you have in the middle, where the arrow points, the GDP, and all these measures are indexed. You see the extraction of various minerals. And so all these minerals, as of compared to 1990, have increased. Some have increased very little, sort of proportionally less than GDP, but some of them have increased more than GDP has increased over time. So the story is the same. There's an increase in consumption. There's inequality in consumption. Even if you just look at inequality across countries, as I said before, there's actually comparable or even larger inequalities within countries that need to be considered. The second big point that the report does is to draw attention to the, if not exclusive, but the disproportionate focus on GDP as a main measure of consumption, which, again, most of you who've taken classes in economics or who work on these issues know that it misses a lot of the economic production that is not mediated through the market, but it also counts as positive things that are damaging to the planet. The focus on GDP that we see at the national level, it has a parallel at the individual level, which is a focus on consumption of material resources and consumerism. And so at the individual level, the report tried to make a distinction between two types of consumptions, the consumption of material resources and the consumption of goods and services that are all relevant to human well-being, but have different implications for the environment. And so there's need to think about how to shift or to favor consumption that is least damaging to the environment. And the fourth issue is what you could call, and I think early on we had debates on this question, which is just the consumption as thresholds of consumption, or the diminishing marginal returns to of consumption in terms of well-being. And so what this map shows here is something that you've seen in other graphs that show the tapering off of the relationship between income and happiness. Below a certain level of income, increase in income, increase happiness, but at a certain point it does not anymore. And so you see that here, beyond a threshold of 5 metric tons per capita, longevity, which is seen here as an indicator of health, doesn't increase anymore. So you have this kind of line that increases at early stages, but then things taper off. Again, consumption, here the idea of the report was to draw attention to the limits of consumption as a source of well-being. Consumption is a contributor, but not the end goal if you want to achieve well-being. Okay. And so thinking of the drivers of consumption, and here what I try to do is, if we think of the classic iPad formulation, in black you have the factors that I emphasize, population size and affluence. And technology is not included here, but these are the main drivers that are emphasized in the classic iPad formula. The report tries to add the ideas that I have put here in red, notably the role of culture in driving preferences and in steering people away from different kinds of consumption and therefore mitigating impact on the environment. Importantly, the report also tries to extend the focus of population beyond just the population size and the population growth, and suggests paying attention to questions such as age structure or the structure of families. So if you have small families, they tend to consume more on a per capita basis. You lose the economies of scale that you have when you have larger families. Age structure does also matter. Population movement matters a lot. The report suggests, for instance, that migration, which we don't necessarily think a great deal about when we are discussing consumption, can affect global consumption in at least 3 different ways. People who migrate, especially when they migrate to higher consumption societies, become uber consumers. They send remittances to their countries of origin, and that affects consumption there as well, tends to increase consumption. And sometimes they also affect ideas and aspiration in their areas of origin. And so population movement, not just population size or growth, has all these potential influences on consumption. And so together, all these population variables transform aspirations, transform the needs on a per capita basis, in addition to the effect that they have on the number of consumers. And so the transition slide here is that we have these rising aspirations, these rising needs for consumption, and yet the report suggests that there are absolute limit to current growth, to meeting the current consumption need of the population. I would personally not be sure if I'd say absolute limits, but there's clearly increased stress in the effort to meet these growing population needs. And so how far we stay away from these limits, to the extent that exists, is going to depend on several factors, population being one of them, but it also depends on consumption, as well as the cultural transformation that we can put in place in order to change our own sense of what well-being is and how we can disconnect it from pure consumption. And so I think it's Elia again.
Okay, so this is our last presentation. I think we should be able to have some time to have a fruitful discussion here. So the report also outlines some of the pathways to sustainable development, some of the issues that we think, given the analysis that was done or the evidence that was synthesized, put together, we highlight some of the implications and make specific recommendations. But before I get into that, let me just outline two case studies that we have in the report, just to emphasize the extent of diversity and the gravity of the challenges that we are facing. So the first one here is Niger, one of the countries in the semi-arid Sahel with low life expectancy, high levels of poverty, high levels of fertility. Fertility rate in Niger is about 7 children per woman. Low use of contraception, low education, a high level of child marriages. You would call them child marriages because actually the median age at first marriage in Niger is 15.5 years. So half of the girls get married by 15.5. So this is one of the least developed countries. I think when we talk about the countries that are the poorest and so on, these are the sort of issues that we are dealing with. And the report makes the recommendation that we need to uplift the well-being of the bottom 1.3 billion people. It's the sort of people, and Niger is quite characteristic of that group of countries where there's actually insufficient material consumption. You would need to increase their consumption level for them to thrive also as human beings. The second one is the UK, which we can say represents the sort of context for the more developed countries. So we see here a very, very low mortality, high life expectancy, low levels of fertility. But aging is quite a major factor there. It's actually projected that by 2050, about a quarter of the population of the UK will actually be over age 65. So there's high level of consumption, and we know it's mostly the consumption that Parfait was talking about that is actually driving the levels of carbon emissions and global warming. So what are some of these pathways towards sustainable development? I think the key point to note is that the current trends of global population and global population growth and material consumption and the concomitant changes in the environment are unsustainable. The report outlines some of these pathways that I'll highlight in the next 3 slides. But the key point is, re-emphasizing what Parfait said. There should be reduction in material consumption, and we need to explore alternative measures of measuring progress in our countries. And another critical point is that we should recognize that demography is not destiny. That through socioeconomic and health policies, appropriate socioeconomic and health policies and investments, we can actually slow down population growth, because already there's high demand around the world for people to, people want to have fewer children than they are having in most of these rapidly growing nations. So if we go to the first issue of changing consumption patterns, again, there's a great need to scale down or radically transform the damaging and largely unnecessary material consumption in the rich countries. At present, consumption is strongly linked to economic models based on growth, which does not account for natural capital. To improve the well-being of individuals and the planet so that both flourish rather than, barely survive, we need to move from the growth-based models towards a circular economy. We need to develop and embrace technology that advances resource efficiency by reducing pollution, reusing equipment, elimination of waste, recycling, and so on. And there should be incentives that will make consumers pay for the wider costs of the overconsumption that we are talking about. And there should also be behavior change. We talk about behavior change when we talk about family planning and childbearing and so on, but there's also great need for behavior change in the way consumption is unfolding in the rich countries especially. But also I think it's important that for the poor countries as they emerge, I think Parfait showed that graph that shows that the emerging countries are actually also increasing their consumption quite rapidly. We need to think about different models of development. I mean, you look at Africa now, it's a virgin sort of a territory. It can take advantage of renewable energies and so on. Development can be designed in a way that is different from the path that the more developed countries have followed. And for this to happen, there's need for political leadership. To try to instigate these lifestyle changes. On demography, the point is that, there's no question about it. The global population growth needs to be slowed down and ultimately stabilized in order for both people and the planet to flourish. But this should be through voluntary and non-coercive means. I think there's been a lot of debate in this with what happened in China and India. But I think the world has moved way ahead of that debate, which I think was settled at the 1994 ICPD conference, that family planning should be, voluntary. People should be given information. They should be able to have free choice. But once they have chosen, it's the responsibility of the international community and the developments in those countries to make sure that women have the contraceptives that they need in order to achieve their fertility aspirations. So countries with rapidly growing populations are least able to keep up with provision of good education and health services, which are needed to build quality human capital. Education will play an important role since educated people live longer, healthier, and more productive lives, and are also more empowered to choose the number of children that they want. On health, better health is central to human happiness and well-being. Important contribution to economic progress as healthy populations live longer and more productive lives. And just to re-emphasize that point, family planning is central to improving well-being. And I think I can go on and on, but most of you already work in this, and I don't want to over-preach to the choir. But really, family planning needs to be made available. Increasingly, more and more women, there are estimates that 215 million women now, want to use have unmet need for family planning. You can argue about what that means, but these are women who want to have fewer children, or they want to postpone the next birth, but they are not using family planning. Not only because family planning is not there are other factors, but lack of family planning is one of the big reasons why they are not able to have to achieve their fertility aspirations. So the point about okay. So what are some of the things that we need to do? I think there's the issue about planning for change. We need to plan. As I said, it's not destiny that we should end up with the sort of numbers, whether it's on consumption and on population, that we can do something about it. Population is not just about numbers. I think this has been emphasized and re-emphasized in these presentations. We need to plan for population decline and aging. For example, using the correct policies to develop sustainable social support systems. Urbanization, as I said, can be a very, very important engine of growth. It can produce efficiencies in energy use, transportation, housing, and so on. But there is need for proper urban planning to ensure that urban dwellers have the infrastructure and social services they need to live healthy and productive lives, and to avoid the spread of slums that we are seeing in most of the cities in the least developed countries. And I think there's also an issue, I want to emphasize that, the explosive growth of slums. It's not just because of population growth. There's poor planning, there's poor governance, and all these issues need to be improved. Migration presents opportunities and challenges, and we need to explore win-win solutions as far as migration is concerned, minimize brain drain and maximize returns from migrants' financial and human capital. Policymakers should also prepare for integration of migrants and for protection of their human rights in the countries where they are moving around. And in order to have a more equal world where the majority are able to flourish, we're talking about having the majority of the people in the world being able to flourish, being able to live decent lives, there's urgent need to reduce material consumption of the richest and increase consumption for the consumption and health care for the poorest 1.3 billion people. So what are the recommendations? As Parfait said, the report makes 9 recommendations. So I'll just go through them quickly. The first one is basically that the international community should work together with countries in the global south or in these least developed countries to bring the 1.3 billion people living on less than $1.25 per day out of absolute poverty. This requires focused efforts in key policy areas, including economic development, education, family planning, and health. The second recommendation is that the most developed and emerging countries must stabilize and then reduce material consumption. It's not an easy task by any means, but it must be done to avoid further damage to the planet and to ensure that we live in a more equal world. We need strong political leadership to drive this forward and major changes in people's lifestyles with clear costs for excessive consumption. Number 3, the report recommends that reproductive health and family planning programs should are urgently required, and there's also a need for strong political leadership and financial commitment to make sure that these programs, services reach out to all women around the world who need them. Most leaders now, I should point out this as one of the people who work with policymakers, at least in Africa, we are seeing a big change. A lot of leaders in around Africa now are recognizing that there's need to do something about family planning. Many of them are supporting family planning or changing their minds because of the effects of family planning on maternal health, child health, and so on. But increasingly, policymakers are willing to listen even to the arguments about the growing populations. Because if you look at Niger, their current population growing 4-fold by 2050, the country can't afford to take care of all these people. So the world is changing. So I think it's very, very important that something should be done about this. Family planning is affordable. I think that's the point that the report also emphasizes, and we need to take care of that. It's affordable and cost-effective. The report mentions that the cost for implementing family planning programs would be estimated at 6.7 to 7.7 billion per year for the developing world. And if you consider how much money is spent on a lot of things that are happening around the globe, really, if money is put on family planning, I think that the global community will be a much healthier place, and a lot of people's well-being would be improved. So population, number 4 is that population and environment, and I should add consumption here, should not be considered as two separate issues. Demographic changes should be included in economic and environmental debate and planning at international meetings like Rio. I mean, those of us who have been trying to work with those specializing on the environment as we lead to the Rio meetings next week, there's been a big struggle to get, the people who are controlling the Rio agenda to even, put in the text, in the documents, consideration of population issues. We hope that it will happen finally, but really you can't separate population consumption and environment from each other. Number 5 is that governments should realize the potential of urbanization to reduce material consumption and environmental impact through efficiency measures. Well-planned provision of services and slum conditions, and there should be well-planned provision of services which will help provide slum conditions and increase the well-being of the urban inhabitants. Number 6 is that there should be financial and non-financial barriers must be overcome to achieve primary and secondary education. When you look at countries like Niger, in the Sahel, and many African countries and South Asia, it can't just be about family planning if girls are marrying at 12 years old, at 13 years old. So there's need really to empower women, to invest in education, to make sure that there's even legislation against child marriages. Number 7, natural and social scientists should increase research efforts on the interrelationships between consumption, demographic change, and environmental impact. Number 8, national governments should accelerate the development of comprehensive wealth measures. I think that's what Parfait was talking about. We need to measure, to have measures of whether a country is developing in a sustainable way, not just increasing GDP. And finally, that there should be strong collaboration between national governments in order to develop socioeconomic systems and institutions that are not dependent on continued material consumption. I think if you follow these recommendations, we stand a much bigger chance that we'll see the majority of people around the world being able to flourish rather than have over 1 billion people who are barely surviving. So what's next? There are a lot of activities going on in terms of disseminating the report. We have a couple of sessions in Rio over the next 2 weeks or so, just to make sure that the message goes to as many audiences as possible. And there are a lot of that bullet shouldn't have been there. I think there was a meeting that was happening in May. Maybe in the process of swapping slides and so on, we ended up with an odd slide. But the message is the same. So this is what the report is about. This is the last slide. And really the message is population, consumption, and environment should not be separated. It's not destiny. We can do something about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Eli, and thank you, Parfait. It was a big topic to handle, and you gave us both breadth and depth in that presentation, and still left us plenty of time for a discussion. A discussion, I should say, we'll have here now, but also the 3 favorite words in Washington, or well, in any city, I suppose, reception to follow. So we'll have a chance to have a chat afterwards as well, informal, and you can buttonhole the 2 of them, and then have the networking conversations that we, of course, want to encourage among all of you as well. As I mentioned, because we're webcasting it, we'd ask that you wait for a microphone to come to you and tell us your name and your question. Please do make it a question rather than a speech so that we have maximum opportunity for folks to participate. Maybe what we'll do also is collect a couple and then let the 2 of you divide and conquer, and because they often then connect as well. So we have Ed down front here, Kaylee, and then we'll get Roger Mark in the middle, in the back. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, Ed Berry with Sustainable World Initiative. First, I'd like to thank the Royal Society for pointing out that we need to stabilize population and that we need to have greater political and financial commitment to family planning. It's very important. There's a lot of good things in the report. But my question has to do with the sense of urgency that's conveyed in the report. And I'd like to refer to the Planet Under Pressure conference, where a group of 5,000 scientists and policymakers made very definitive statements about how we're already overutilizing planetary resources and already putting the planet at risk, and that's the foundation for all human development. So I'm wondering, why didn't the Royal Society choose to take a stronger stand or make a stronger statement about that? And wouldn't that, in fact, convey a sense of urgency and more needed commitment to family planning? Thanks.
Okay, if you could pass that to Roger Mark. I didn't think you were going to be taken to task for that one. I thought, Ed, this would be finally one of the presentations you'd like. They told us, no, reduce material input and get off a consumption basis. I know it's all right. We need you to keep pushing us. But Roger Mark, please.
Thank you, and thanks for the great presentation. Roger Mark D'Souza, Population Action International. Actually, my question is a little similar to Ed's, and I was intrigued that you were both speaking. You spoke about climate change issues, particularly from a mitigation perspective, and you also spoke about population dynamics, and you mentioned population momentum. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit about how the Royal Society Committee looked at change that is already happening, and how society and we as human beings are adapting to that change, both from a population perspective and an environment, particularly climate change perspective, and what does that mean for policy?
Okay, and then there's one right straight in the back of that row. Need to wear my glasses. I can see.
Hello. Lawrence Freeman from the African Desk at EIR Magazine. It seems like the premises of what you're discussing is the same argument that came out in the 1960s and 1970s of the limit to growth, that there's finite resources and we have to reduce consumption and reduce population. And I think that's totally wrong. There's no evidence for that. I mean, that's the old Malthusian dogma. The biosphere is capable of unlimited development. And when you add man's creative capability, you have the noosphere. And if you look at the past 500 million great extinctions, you've seen that certain species are pushed away, and then other more powerful species with higher energy flux density, such as the mammals in the Cretaceous period taking over from the dinosaurs, is proof that the second law of entropy is wrong. And I think that we have to look at things differently. There's not a water scarcity. We can create water by moving water. There's not an arable land scarcity. There's not a food problem. We're not pushing up against any limit. There actually are no limits to growth with man's creative intervention. And the World Wildlife Fund has called for reducing the population to 1 to 2 billion people. And Paul Ehrlich, after your report was produced, said we should have 1.5 to 2 billion people on the planet. So how do you plan on getting rid of 5 billion people?
Mm-hmm. So as you can see, we have from the first comment and our third comment, we have and everything in between in terms of framing. Why don't we take one more, Karen, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to respond.
Thank you. Karen Hardy from the Futures Group. I'd like to add my thanks to this amazing report and this session on your presentations. You talked about sort of gearing this towards the Rio Summit, which of course is very important, but what about what comes after the Millennium Development Goals? Is there sort of talk in the Royal Society of also sort of doing advocacy to make sure that these issues are included in what comes after the MDGs? Thank you.
Okay, great. So some wide-ranging framing questions and then some very specific ones on how you use the report and going forward. Would you like to game plan a divide and conquer?
Okay. All right. I was trying to pass the button to Parfait, but he wouldn't take it. So I'll try to respond to some of these questions, and then he'll do the rest. I think the question about the agency. I mean, again, this was a report that was covering a lot of issues. I think that the issue about the need to do something about slowing down population is highlighted in the report. It's among the key recommendations. And, the distinction, actually, of looking at the regions by these characteristics and the least developed countries, the high fertility countries, rapid population growth, is basically to emphasize that point, that it's not about looking at this issue globally. There are just a few countries. Their current population size is not that huge, 12%, but it will reach close to 30% if nothing is done, but it may even be more than that. So I think that the report emphasizes the issue. It calls for voluntary means of addressing this issue, and I think there's no other way that you can do it. On the issue of the report that came out, is it in the neo-Malthusian sort of language that our colleague there says he sees in this report. I think there are key differences between what was in the 60s and what is there. I think when people were talking about global warming and so on, the evidence was not that much. Roger Mark asked the question about what is already happening. I mean, we see that a lot of the countries where population is growing rapidly are also the same countries that are actually facing the most severe effects of climate change, the Sahel, where Niger is. So I think that the issue, technology, yes, can help, innovation can help, but the point is that, even now we still have 1.3 billion people living under this extreme poverty. And there's something that needs to be done to address that. And the issue about slowing down population growth, I don't think anybody is saying you go there and mass sterilize people and so on. It's through voluntary means. There's already high demand for people to limit fertility, to reduce the number of children that they want to have throughout the developing world. So I don't think it's about imposing, it's about making sure that if you meet that unmet need of family planning that is there, fertility would already go down by 1 or 2 children in many of these countries. So I think I would stop there. I think Roger marked the issue about what is already happening. Yeah, we know there's a strong link between population dynamics and considerations of climate change. If you look at the US or even Great Britain, these are some of the more developed countries that are whose populations are still growing. That has huge impacts, much more than what the population growth in Niger could have on global warming. So the issue about slowing down population growth in those areas, the issue about looking at the numbers, the balance between the environment and people's well-being, but there's also the issue that people want to reduce their fertility there. And what we're asking for, what the report is asking for, really are the proper investments to make that, to enable them to do that.
Okay, I'll start with for me, the most challenging question, which is the question you raised about the limits to growth and to what extent we can be assertive about this particular question. And we're all aware that there are very different positions on this particular question. That's why I prefaced my remarks by not only at the end saying that I would have been less focused on just the notion of limits as much as the notion of a stress. And also recognizing that in questions about these debates about impacts, we have to be relatively modest as social scientists. Now, having said this, my interest in this particular paper is that it was not necessarily about the limits to growth. It was about the relevance of growth. Is growth what we ought to be after? Is growth what is conducive to human well-being, number one. Number two, even if there's no limit to growth, I personally, based on my experience, had questions about limits to equitable growth. Even though you may have innovation and adaptation, it is my experience that a lot of these adaptations would happen on the back of the powerless. And therefore, we run better chances of promoting equitable development sustainable development if we can sort of slow both the process of consumption and at the high end, and also population. So that's my question here. But and this question leads to the first question about the strongest statement about the urgency. A little bit of this can be understood when you know how the committee was composed. Sir John Sultan, as I understand it, was in his first cut on these particular questions. And it was a little scary at first, I have to admit, for someone to just jump and say, okay, well, I'm going to study this question that people have been. And it turned out to be maybe a good idea because he could have a little bit of distance with some of these old debates and guide us through new thinking about this question. Now, we had a large, at least they had a large call for papers, evidence, and so they received submissions from over 100 people who just sent documentation for them to read and summarize for all of us to complete. And so in the process, I think this particular piece of information, I don't know how it may not have been accessible to them. Because you didn't have a single author, you had just people with very different ideas and perspectives coming together and sifting through. And so I agree that all else equals, this would have been something important to stress in order to just get the sense of urgency. But also, the final product, which had to be, I'm told, 100 pages, there's a lot that is left on the cutting floor. I understand. So there are many things that were left. This shouldn't have been, but there are many things that were left. The MDGs, I think that's personally also one reason why I was interested in participating in this effort. You may still not believe it, but I come from Africa. And I was really interested. I truly believe that this continent has a chance to improve well-being, depending on how it manages the next few decades. And so I was interested in knowing more about not just the consumption, the economy, but also population. Elia and I participate in several networks trying to make sense of this idea of demographic dividends. And it's clear to us that even though the MDG agenda has tried to stay clear of population, it's virtually impossible. All the indicators that I see are either intrinsically demographic or have a strong demographic component. If you're talking about reducing poverty rates, which is the percentage of people under poverty. If you think about stratification and the reproduction of inequality and poverty across generation and the role that differential fertility and reproduction plays, there's no way you can sidestep population. If you're talking about maternal mortality and child mortality, it doesn't make sense to set population aside. And so whatever happens on the political front, on the scientific front, I think this is an important agenda for us social scientists to try to understand the connection between population and these outcomes that are meant to be portrayed as purely economic, but truly are not. Roger, I'm not quite sure. Did Elia answer the question? You were interested in seeing how populations are already adapting to changes happening?
So to what degree did the committee talk about those issues?
Oh, I see.
Already happening, with how people are adapting to change and what that means for policies right
now. I think the issue about climate change was deliberated upon quite extensively. It comes in the sections where we talk about the environment, because there's now, in a way, climate change has become the face of the whole concept of environment. It's increasingly becoming so. But we didn't go into specific sort of country case studies on how that is happening, how countries are actually adapting, or how communities are adapting. I think, given that it was a very, very broad, agenda, the population issue, we couldn't really go into the specifics. But during the discussions, this issue came up, and there was that recognition. That population growth and the other dynamics actually, they undermine the capacity of communities and countries, especially the least developed countries, to adapt to the adverse consequences of climate change. In the Niger case study, that point is emphasized.
And just on the community level, as we travel through Africa, you hear echoes of some of the big concerns that would be raised in places like this. You hear people talk about the youth bulge, even though they may sometimes be overstatements. You hear people talking about the food riots and seeing some connection. In countries that have serious problem with desertification, you also hear people make that connection. People do make those connections. Now, how they come to that assessment, it's also unclear because you have a lot of parroting issues that heavily present in the media, or if it's an independent assessment, I couldn't tell. But I do hear some echoes of those conversations on the ground.
Jason, then Peggy, and then there's a hand back there I can't see in the dark. Uh-huh.
Thanks, Parfait and Elia, for the presentation. My question is that, in my experience, European audiences and European dialogue have been reluctant to make these population-environment connections maybe over the last 2 decades, maybe since 1994. And it seems like there's a reemergence with, as you mentioned, the Population Footprints Conference and this report. I'm wondering, as you've launched this in the UK and perhaps elsewhere in Europe, how it's been received and whether we're actually seeing a change in Europe in a willingness to have this dialogue.
If you could just pass the microphone forward to Peggy, that'd be great. Thanks, Jason.
Hello, Peggy Clark with the Aspen Institute. Thank you for your great presentation, and we've all been awaiting this report's outcome, so congratulations. 2 questions. How do you see the findings of this report playing out in Rio, if at all? And secondly, in Malawi, I think you're from Malawi, is that not correct?
Yes, I am.
In Malawi, where we've seen the dramatic declines in fertility rates, are there connections being made between environmental concerns and the population pressures and the advances that have been made on the health front? Is there a relationship between those two in Malawi?
And back here, yeah.
Hi, I'm Wendy Marie Thomas, and I'm actually a meteorologist with the American Meteorological Society. And my question deals with the GDP piece, and I'll explain why. Is that I'm working with some international partners who are trying to justify the expense of hydromet instruments, but yet they compare them to GDP in the developing world, which is really a no-sellable argument. So I'd like to understand what you would like to see as other wealth measures, and if there are other models that you've already used or something that's out there. I'm not an economist, so it would be helpful to know what you're considering.
Okay. Terrific. And Kaylee, if you could bring it down here to Scott down front.
Yeah, thank you both for your presentations and for the work, this 2-year effort. I wanted just to maybe add on to what Elias said about the Africa, that it's not uniform. There's a lot of diversity in Africa, and as you said, it's the northern countries of Africa and the southern countries that have lower fertility, have higher contraceptive use. But I'd also add that many of the countries in East Africa have made progress in increasing contraceptive use. Malawi was just mentioned, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Rwanda, Uganda now. There are a lot of examples of fairly significant increases in access and use of contraception, reductions in fertility. And it's really West Africa that's made the least progress. And I also wanted to say that it sounds like the recommendations are around focusing on the least developed countries, but I wondered if you struggled with India at all, because India, I guess overall has relatively high contraceptive use, but the northern part of India, of course, is very different from the southern part, and some of the states in the northern parts of Africa look more like of India look more like Africa than the southern part of India, and you classify those as middle income country, and yet there's a huge need in the north of India. Thanks.
Take those four.
Okay, I'll go again. So the issue about how this report was received in the UK, I participated in the launch in the UK. I think the sort of the report has been quite well received. I think the issue about emphasizing the point that you shouldn't look at population, consumption and environment as separate issues. You need to find ways in which they can be more effectively integrated, and that when you look really at the finite, resources that we have, we can't continue growing the population at the current rate and consumption at the rate that it's growing. So I think the main issue was in the discussions related to what you do about reducing consumption. It appears when you look at the report and the recommendations, the population issue is very, very sensitive because, a lot of people think, when you talk about reducing population or slowing down population growth in the least developed countries, you are imposing on these communities, or you are blaming the victims of global warming. But that's why I want to emphasize the point that, the whole emphasis of slowing down population growth was for the sake of development in those regions. I think it's clear that there's no country that can really develop from being least developed to middle income when women are having 7 children. How do women get to have 7 children? It's when you marry at age 16, at age 18. It means you don't go to school. It means these countries can't develop. So it's a development issue on its own, and it's not really emphasizing it for the sake of maybe even global environmental issues. It's because those countries recognize that for them to develop, they have to empower the women, they have to improve education, and they have to slow down population growth. So I think a lot of the discussions came around what sort of incentives, how can you really enforce or make sure that you get people to reduce consumption. So I think there's no very, very clear evidence there on what can be done, but it's an issue that needs to be tackled. The question about how this is expected to play out in Rio, we've participated in a few Rio processes, but I think that population is at the periphery of all those discussions. We're going to be in Rio. We'll meet with committees and so on. There was a meeting, a preparatory meeting for African countries in Nairobi. Is it about 2 months ago, to talk about the Rio? And at that point, I met the head of the UNFPA in Nairobi, who attended that meeting, and he told me he was quite alarmed that there was hardly any mention of population in all those discussions. And he asked me the question that, have we missed the boat again, as was done in the issues to do with the MDGs? So I think there are efforts, there are a lot of sessions. We'll have a side session to talk about this. And so we'll see. We are going to be meeting various country representatives, country teams, to make sure that we can get the message across. When we launched this report, we went for a meeting with the Parliamentary Population Group in the UK to talk to them about the report. And one of the suggestions that was made there was that we should try to get the UK government to really try to influence the process in Rio so that population becomes one of the key agenda items. So we hope that something will happen. I think the issue about Malawi, Scott talked about Malawi having increased contraceptive use, which is good, but Malawi just had a national population conference 3 weeks ago, and one of the frustrating things there by policymakers and all stakeholders is that fertility is still at close to 6 children per woman when contraceptive use is 46. So there's that and other issues. So fertility hasn't declined that much, but there's quite, a strong emphasis now on the linkage between population growth and natural resources and development and women's health and so on.
Just to comment on the whether India gave the team pause, and I think for me it's a broader comment about variability and the extent to which you just see enormous differences across within regions and within countries. And so for us, it's interesting in two contradictory ways. One is it makes it possible to understand why do we have these differences to begin with. Why do you have proximate regions and proximate groups and individuals behaving differently? And what are the consequences that follow from these differences in behavior? So it's interesting from an analytical standpoint. Now, at the other end, the idea is that in many ways, there's also a shared destiny. That is, some of the consequences are born collectively. Even the consequences for the environment, or even at the national level, the consequences for the size of the youth cohort, etc., are going to be born collectively, regardless of who makes what choice. And so I'm personally very much interested in variability. There's an interesting question about other measures alternative to GDP that would be acceptable. Since Dudley Sears in the 70s, people have been looking for alternative to GDP and tossing in inequality, tossing in health and longevity and education. It's a start. The main idea here is just to recognize the importance of consumption, but also the limits of consumption, to understand, to acknowledge the fact that there are many tangible aspects such as freedom, the rule of law, social capital, network, stable families, stable environment that are equally contributing to human well-being. Now, how you work these into a measure and whether it displaces GDP per capita is a second order. But for me, the interesting thing was just to begin to recognize to continue to recognize the limitations of GDP.
Okay, we're going to do a quick final round because I'm sensitive that there's only one flight that goes back to Ithaca tonight. We want to make sure Parfait's on it. But why don't we come down and get Lincoln, this gentleman here, and then very quick responses, and then we can continue the conversation and the reception. So please, sir.
Thank you very much for this session. It's very enlightening. There was some reference, and I haven't read the report, but I believe it's in the report also, to migration. And the recommendations seem to exclude anything in that Pandora's box that you'd like to see governments and other decision makers promote in the context of global migration, as particularly in the context of employment or jobs, which could be another element of another alternative to GDP as a social welfare quality. There seems like there's a kind of quasi-Malthusianism prevalent in the world on labor or on employment, where especially with the youth bulge, the pressure for jobs seems to, at least superficially, to outpace the availability of jobs. So what about migration, and particularly in the employment area? Why don't we have a strong recommendation from you on that subject?
Okay. If you can pass it down here to Professor Day, another demographer.
My name is Lincoln Day. I'm a retired demographer and sociologist. This was a marvelous presentation. I'm really very impressed with it. I think particularly what you had to do in summarizing the situation with reference to population I would only add a couple of things having to do with consumption. To give you an idea of what I think are great barriers to what needs to be done. One is about 10 years ago, I attended a hearing in Congress here, and they had executives from the major automobile manufacturers who were speaking against a proposal to limit emissions or to get fuel efficiency in cars. And these three gentlemen insisted that it was absolutely impossible, that all they were doing was giving the people what they want, as though they had never had any advertising programs at all. The other thing is, and this I think is a very important thing, and it wasn't mentioned at all, and that is militarism as a consumption of resources. Half of the budget of the United States is now going into preparations for war, payments for past wars, continuation of current wars, and the United States is spending as much as all on military activity as much as all the rest of the world combined.
Parfait, Elia, just a couple final comments and then we'll continue the conversation upstairs or outside.
I think there's a recommendation in the report about international migration and the need to, I think, in the host countries to accommodate international migration and recognize the human right or something of this kind. Maybe it's not as strong as it ought to be, but there is a recommendation in the report about migration, international migration. Yes, I like the argument of the car lobby and other lobbies that are in pushing consumption. And in many ways, the difficulty, not the difficulty, the appearance of the only reason why it may seem difficult for people to underconsume or appropriately consume is just because there's extensive advertising and a very strong lobby for consumption. I don't think there's an equally strong lobby for again, here I'm editorializing. These are my views. That is, when you look at much of the industrial world, consumption has gone beyond the threshold of usefulness, and sometimes inches close to harm. That is, we consume beyond what is not only good, but also healthy for us. We consume more than we need or more than we should. And because we are, conditioned to do so, not because it's necessarily something that we want or something that is good for us. Thank you.
Okay, good. We'll leave it there. I urge you to pick up the copies that are online. We have the URL and the hashtag I should have mentioned up front for those of you who may have been tweeting throughout today. We do have a hashtag for the report that Royal Society has set up. We urge you to tell folks about the video from today's session that will be archived on the Wilson Center website, as well as the PowerPoints as well. So right before we join everyone outside of the reception, please join me in thanking our guests today for today's session.